Once upon a time, a general went duck hunting with his prospective son-in-law when the young man introduced his dog. This hunting dog could be silent in several languages or make a terrific racket, whatever the situation required. He could hunt with his master or by himself, but the general has never been impressed with any suitor of his daughter, and has set out to prove once and for all what a lame duck this youngster is. A stream of caustic remarks flowed from the general, while suitor and dog kept the peace. An ill-planned shot by the general landed a duck in the water, but the dog retrieved the duck by running on top of the water, like a thoroughbred Presbyterian, hardly making a splash before placing the duck by the feet of the general. The general snorted incredulously and remarked, "You call this a hunting dog, but he cannot even swim." When criticism is total and unconditional, one should consider if perhaps the dog has nothing to do with it. If you Google MMS, you should at least ask the question, why anything as harmless as a water purification tablet deserves 90% negative reviews by page after page of experts. They even failed to mention the one undisputed fact that it really does purify water. On the other end of the spectrum are the users of MMS. It stands to reason that they will be better acquainted with any effects, both beneficial and adverse. But Google and YouTube has removed information that may convince anybody that cleaning water may be useful to the human body. DuckDuckGo is a search engine that does not pray to Saint Algorithm for the best answer, but simply returns the query for MMS testimonials. You really should visit this page and convince yourself if a dog running on water is a benefit or not. Your interest in this book likely indicates that some condition is causing you discomfort, for which Dr. Ouchie has no solution, or the medication on offer does not help, or either the cost or side effects are prohibitive. It is not marketing that brought you here. It is hope. It is likely you came to the right place. Chapter 1. The Discovery. The phone was ringing at the other end of a long, narrow house. There was furniture to get around and a hallway to get through. But despite the obstacle course, I made it. Bill was an old friend, calling from Chicago. "Jim, are you any good at prospecting for gold?" Avoiding understatement, I replied, "I'm the best." That was enough for him, as he was familiar with my work. He continued, "I'm working with a group that wants to mine gold in a jungle in South America. We need your help. We are paying the going rate, plus you get a share of the profits. I would leave in a month, as I had to ship my gold recovery equipment that was part of the deal. I also had to prepare myself for the jungle. Water in the jungle requires purification to prevent disease, and the air buzzing with malaria requires a miracle. A miracle was just the thing a friend of mine was boasting about. He lives a little way outside of Las Vegas and has been using stabilized oxygen personally as well as for his animals. He gave it to his chickens and his dogs in their drinking water. He even injected some into his dog's veins during a bout of some ailment, and his dog was cured in several hours. It furthermore transpired that stabilized oxygen, which forms a peroxide, is reported to be helpful in treating malaria. It seemed the most important equipment I should take with me was an ample supply of stabilized oxygen. I thought to test it myself and sent a sample of sewage water treated with stabilized oxygen to a laboratory for testing, and the lab results showed no surviving pathogens. I was reasonably confident that I could purify my drinking water in the jungle. It was, however, the limitations of stabilized oxygen treatment that led to the development of MMS. The way in which peroxide eliminates pathogens is a subject that elicits such debate as to make the moon landing a cornerstone of consensus. But as a trained metallurgist with an understanding of chemistry, I developed a more likely hypothesis that led to the development of MMS. My friend Bill sent a contract to my house in Las Vegas, Nevada, where I lived in retirement from gold mining. The contract was quite generous. I was to be paid a reasonable salary, and I would have 20% ownership in the operation, provided I located gold in the jungle. I was 64 years old, but healthy and confident I could navigate the jungle. The jungle was in Guyana, which is short for British Guiana since 1966, when the British Empire became independent from Guyana, situated just south of Venezuela on the east coast of South America. I arrived about mid-year of 1996 and was met by several people who would be part of the mining operation. They led me through the lines at the airport and we drove about 30 miles to Georgetown, Guyana's largest city, which is also the capital. I would never have guessed that King George would be named after such a humble outpost of civilization, but there it was. I was taken to a local house where we would prepare for the trek to the interior, to prospect Guyana's greatest rainforest, a real jungle. Mike was a local who owned the claims to a very large portion of the jungle. Jewel was an investor from the USA. Peter was related to a high official in government, a minister called Moses. I was invited to the minister's house for dinner the second evening that I was there. During dinner, Minister Moses complained of a back problem that was hindering him in his duties. I offered a therapy to correct his neck, as I thought it may relieve the pain in his back. So after dinner he allowed me to adjust his neck, which I did very carefully. He was a minister after all. Within minutes his back problem began to subside. We were all amazed, and soon he was walking quite easily around the house. The next day one of the servants called and asked me to do the same for the daughter, as she was having similar back problems. That night was the third evening I was there, and after dinner I adjusted her neck also. Her name was Angela, and to our amazement she was soon walking easily and her back problem seemed much better. I did not always have such great results, but I was ever thankful for having acquired the skill. Making such a powerful friend as Minister Moses was important, even though I did not yet know how important it would become. The government had a laboratory where they bought gold from the local miners. All the gold that came in was completely covered with mercury. They would burn off the mercury before weighing the gold, but mercury fumes are extremely poisonous. I guided them in building a fume scrubber to solve the mercury problem, and so gained the graces of officials in government. As a token of reciprocity, they provided a friend of mine with paperwork to migrate from Russia to Guyana, and I felt confident that a constructive relationship had been established. I would later discover that Big Pharma has an even more constructive relationship with government. The trip into the interior took about 2 days. It took about an hour from Georgetown to the town of Parika on the Mazaruni-Cuyuni River. We loaded our supplies into a large truck and 4 taxis. We arrived at Parika and loaded our supplies into several large speedboats. The river at this point is more than 5 miles wide. We finally arrived at the town of Partika, which is considered the gateway to the interior of the country of Guyana. There we bought mostly food supplies. There are a number of food stores constructed like warehouses which mostly supply excursions to the interior. We loaded the supplies into several boats and crossed the river to a port on the other side, where we transferred our supplies and equipment onto 2 very large trucks. The supplies were tied down securely, and most of the men then elected to walk on a somewhat shorter route to the next jump-off point into the jungle. I soon learned why they preferred to walk, as the road was so rough and the trucks bounced so badly that it took constant attention to just hold on. There was no sleeping during the 5 hours that the trucks took to arrive at a jump-off point to the river leg of our journey. We arrived after dark and slept wherever we could that night. I slept on the bench outside of a small store. The next morning we again loaded all of our supplies in boats and continued up what was now the Cuyuni branch of the river. Boats in this river are usually loaded to the gills, as the saying goes. The sides of the boats were less than 4 inches above the water. It wouldn't require a very large wave to come over the side one time, and the boat loaded as it was, would sink to the bottom. However, it just happens that there almost never were any large waves on these rivers. Storms seldom occur in the jungle. It rains terribly hard, but very little wind accompanies the rain. Excepting the masses of rain ruining roads and breeding mosquitoes, there are seldom natural disasters like forest fires, storms, or hurricanes around here. We traveled upriver for about 4 hours and arrived where the last jump-off point actually was. After we unloaded the boats and they pulled away, the men began loading themselves with supplies. They carried the loads against their backs, but the weight was on their heads. The strap went around the top of their head, down to the pack against their back. They claimed that this was the least tiring of any method of carrying loads. They carried loads of up to 80 pounds through the jungle and mountains. We would have to travel up and over a jungle hill which morphed into a mountain the higher we climbed. The mountain was totally covered in jungle. In this area where the humidity is 100% and felt like 200%, it does not matter if it rains or not. One is very soon soaking wet as the perspiration cannot evaporate. Some of the men had to make several trips over the mountain in order to get all of our supplies to the other side. It took almost 2 complete days of travel to arrive at our campsite. It is safe to say this was not an urban area. Several days later, 2 of our men came down with malaria. Considering all of the data that I had learned about stabilized oxygen, it seemed to me, knowing it killed pathogens in water, and considering humans are mostly water, it may kill pathogens in humans too. I sat down with the men who had malaria and asked them if they would be interested in trying this health drink from America. They were very sick and suffering. They lay in their hammocks shivering from the chills and at the same time with high fever. Their symptoms included headaches, aching muscles and joints, nausea, diarrhea and vomiting. They were willing to try anything. And so they did. Chapter 2. The Discovery. I gave them each a healthy dose of the stabilized oxygen in some water. In 1 hour the shivering stopped. That didn't mean much as the shivering comes and go, but they looked a little better. 4 hours later they were sitting up, kidding around how bad they had been feeling. They got up out of their hammocks and sat down at the table to eat dinner that evening. The next morning 2 more men had come down with malaria. They took the same doses of stabilized oxygen and they were feeling okay by noon. We all were amazed, but would later discover that the stabilized oxygen does not work all the time. I continued with the gold prospecting. I had developed a method of assaying for gold that was quite simple. I was able to conduct assays myself instead of having to send my assays off to the lab somewhere and wait a couple of weeks for the answer. I did quite a bit of traveling in the jungle. Wherever I went, I treated people for malaria and sometimes typhoid fever. The stabilized oxygen worked about 70% of the time and became a very sought-after treatment. On the way back to town, during the first trip into the jungle, we reached a mining operation that was shut down for vacation. There were a number of men who were merely waiting for the mill to start up again. One of the men was sitting at a table looking very sick. I asked him what was wrong, and he said that he was waiting for a boat to pick him up. He said he had typhoid fever and malaria at the same time. I mentioned my stabilized oxygen, which I merely called a health drink, and he said he would try it. On my return from town, he came running out to meet me. He grabbed my hand and pumped it up and down. He told me that he had gotten better within hours after I left, and he didn't have to go to town after all. Despite many people getting helped in this way, there were a lot of people it did not help. Still, it was a treatment that got much better results. People in malaria areas cannot afford to take the malaria preventative medicines, as side effects always develop after a time. Visitors can usually only afford to take malaria medicines for a short period. As it turned out, several of my associates were hospitalized as a result of the preventative medicines. Back in Georgetown, I telephoned a friend, Bob Tate, about the stabilized oxygen curing malaria. He immediately flew to Guyana. We discussed it and decided to see if we could sell the stabilized oxygen in Guyana. We put an ad in the local paper stating that our solution cured malaria. That was a mistake. Immediately, the local television station sent reporters over to our place, and we were on TV telling about our solution. Then the radio and newspaper reporters arrived. We were famous for about 3 days. Then the government dropped a bomb on us. The Minister of Health called us in for an interview. She told us that if we sold our solution to one more person, that we would be in their prison and that we would not like their prison. I had seen their prison and I knew that we have found consensus on at least one point. I talked to my friend, the First Minister Moses Nakamutu, one evening. He explained to me that 2 drug companies had called the Minister of Health and threatened to quit shipping drugs to the local hospital if she did not do something about the person claiming to be able to cure malaria. He explained that there was nothing his government could do at this time to help me, but he mentioned that he suggested to the Minister of Health that she give me some latitude. At that point I made an even bigger mistake. Although we removed our ad from the newspaper, I continued to sell the solution to more people who needed it. My partner, Bob Tate, had already gone home. We were just about ready with our mining supplies when I got word that they were going to charge me with a crime and that it would be better if I were gone. I found that people in Georgetown are more afraid of the jungle than the people from Las Vegas. They seldom chase people into the jungle. I immediately made a trip up the river and the supplies followed me a few days later. This is the basic story of the discovery that stabilized oxygen sometimes cure malaria. However, that is only the beginning of my story. I did not consider it a miracle supplement yet. I stayed upriver for slightly over 6 months, working on the gold mill. Joel Kane was very slow in arriving and never provided additional money. When he finally arrived, after he saw the gold my mill was recovering, he wanted complete ownership and offered me 3% instead of the 20% in the contract. We could not resolve our difference and I went my own way. He was surprised to discover that hardware alone does not entice gold to seep out of the ground all by itself, and in the end the entire operation petered out. I returned to the USA with a much better understanding of the potential and limitations of using stabilized oxygen, which forms a peroxide in treating malaria. I no longer cared about the gold. I began researching why stabilized oxygen only worked part of the time. A few months later, another mining company hired me to help improve their recovery of gold. I was still working with the stabilized oxygen when one night I allowed myself to be bitten hundreds of times by mosquitoes. It really wasn't planned, but when the mosquitoes started biting, I just let them be. Several days later, I experienced the first warning signs. The very first symptom was a slight indigestion during a meal, only a slight feeling of nausea that passed in about 15 minutes. I did not feel the real nausea until the next day. Of course, I was going to test my own medicine, so I decided to wait until I got a blood test at the hospital in Georgetown before starting any treatment. That was almost a fatal mistake. The bus that runs from that part of the jungle to Georgetown did not come, and I know that almost always people who wait too long for treatment end up dead. I waited a couple of days for the bus, but it didn't arrive, and I was getting very sick. Still, I wanted to be sure, and the best way is with a blood test. I was going home soon, and I would not have any chance to do further testing of this kind in the US. I didn't tell anybody I was performing a test on myself. My employers, seeing how sick I was, felt responsible for getting me back to town. So when I agreed to share the airfare, a plane arrived the next day. Now my 4th day of being sick, and took me straight to the hospital in Georgetown. At the hospital, I waited several hours, but as expected, the doctor told me that my blood tested positive for malaria. I was an outpatient, so he just gave me a small bottle of malaria pills. Of course, I did not take the pills. Instead, I took a large dose of my own medicine. Within hours, I was feeling better. I went back to the hospital and had another blood test, and that confirmed a negative result. I was relieved that it worked this time and elated to have medical confirmation of the blood tests. I was the first patient to have blood tests both before and after taking the stabilized oxygen. I believed that I had discovered a cure for malaria. I planned to leave Guyana, but met an old friend from Canada who was there to do some diamond mining. We shook hands and sat down at a sidewalk cafe to talk. As we were talking, he noticed a friend of his shuffling down the street. He called out and the friend came over. We were introduced. He looked very tired and quite sick. I asked him what was wrong, and he said he had malaria. He said the drugs that the hospital gave him didn't seem to help much. I said, well, you just happened to come to the right place. I explained what I had just found out about curing malaria. I mixed him a drink and he had it just there at the sidewalk cafe. We continued to talk. After about half an hour, he said, you know, at least my imagination is still working. I feel a little bit better. All in all, we sat there about 2 hours after he took the solution. In that small amount of time, all of his symptoms were gone. I gave him a small bottle of the solution, and later that night he came to where I was staying and got another bottle from me. I realized I had the joyful task of getting this information properly researched and revealed to the whole world. Imagine the amount of misery it would prevent. Chapter 3. The development of MMS. I came to understand that there are two types of medicine in the world, the kind that increase profits of pharmaceutical companies and the kind that does not. Neither kind publish their formulas, but most money is made through patenting. When medication cannot be patented, it can be reproduced at will, introducing competition. Let's say hypothetically that much money and effort has been expended to gain FDA approval for a product that cures malaria at a reasonable price in a controlled environment, producing a fixed income stream to all involved. One has indeed found a pot of gold. Now let's imagine that by some happy accident, an innocent health supplement has the fortunate side effect of killing malaria almost instantly. It stands to reason that many people would be very happy, but of course many other people would lose their gold. Now let's imagine government sitting around the same pot likely to lose its luster. Is it any surprise that both government and pharmaceutical companies do what they can to minimize their loss? What would you do? What can you do? Perhaps the only thing to do is to keep an open mind and realize that not everything you are told serves your interest. Even this book is but a resource, not a prescription. It took no small amount of investigation to discover that stabilized oxygen consists of sodium chloride at a strength of approximately 3.5%. With this information alone, a competent chemist can produce chlorine dioxide, and chlorine dioxide kills the malaria parasite in hours. Stabilized oxygen has the chemical expression of O2, representing a molecule made from 2 atoms of oxygen. Oxygen in almost any form seems to have health benefits. The oxygen atom is good for breathing, as air contains 22% oxygen. This oxygen can be expressed as O1 to distinguish it from O2, which can exist alone as stabilized oxygen, or O3, that is ozone. Oxygen atoms become liquid at minus 183 degrees Celsius. So when buying oxygen drops at room temperature, it is useful to understand the power of marketing. It's more like oxygen molecules in the bottle, not atoms. The molecules, or O2, are more stable and remain so in various proprietary solutions provided by different companies under names like Dexterity Health, Cell Food, Pure Liquid Oxygen, etc. All are indicated to oxygenize the blood and improve health and energy. I can personally attest that its health benefits are indisputable. What did not make sense was the inconsistency of results. If oxidation of pathogens is caused by oxygen enrichment, it should work consistently at a constant concentration. Furthermore, breathing pure O2 will suffocate the body as surely as breathing CO2 does. And even if destabilizing of O2 liberates some atoms to oxygenate the blood, how can a few drops supply more oxygen to the blood than running around the block does? Why does exercise not cure malaria, yet stabilized oxygen does so about 7 out of 10 times? I suspected that the prevailing theory on the workings of oxygen drops may not tell the whole story. To find malaria patients willing to continue testing, I began writing to various pen pals in Africa. Finally, I made friends with a man in Tanzania who took people on safaris to Mount Kilimanjaro. His name was Moses Agustino. He agreed to administer O2 drops to people with malaria and became my proxy observer. His results were similar to mine in that most people got better very soon after taking the drops, while others remained sick. Meanwhile, I was working to find out why it wasn't 100% effective. I learned that Dr. William F. Koch first started working with this solution in Germany back in 1926. He believed that the stabilized oxygen produced oxygen identical to breathing, but again, such oxygenation that may occur will require the O2 molecule to revert back to its atomic state, which is O1, by being destabilized or dismantled from one molecule into two separate oxygen atoms to be useful to the body. The question remained, what kills a malaria parasite? Conceivably, an abundance of oxygen has a better chance of oxidizing carbon to form CO2 and to remove various toxins from the body, but there does not seem to be a direct correlation between the blood oxygen and the survival of the malaria parasite. If there was a correlation, everybody would be healed from simply digesting O2 drops, or even better, go for a run. During breathing, the same amount of oxygen entering the lungs is again expelled by the lungs, usually having combined with carbon and some other elements to be breathed out as oxides. It likely cures many ailments, but not the malaria parasite, and yet something is sometimes killing this parasite. If I could discover what this something is, I may be able to figure out how to activate its formation more consistently so it would work every time. One company selling O2 drops mentioned that after you put the drops into a glass of water, it became unstable, and thus you should never wait more than an hour before drinking the mixture. I started a series of experiments to confirm the consistency of O2 drops, but also started to suspect that its unstable aspect may be a key to the riddle. I placed 10 drops into a glass of water, waited for about 8 hours, and then smelled it, like chemists often do. I thought I smelled chlorine. I realized that if water makes the stabilized oxygen unstable, it was because the water is less alkaline. I repeated the process, adding a little vinegar to accelerate the process of instability, as the suppliers call it. This time there was no doubt I smelled chlorine. To test my mixture, I brought some chlorine measuring sticks. After a few hours, the mixture began to measure a slight amount, and after 24 hours it measured at least 1 part per million of chlorine dioxide. It seemed to me that I was getting closer to the answer. Considering the most likely reason for the O2 molecule to become unstable or activated or turned into two oxygen atoms, I realized that ultimately the O2 drops end inside the stomach, where it interacts with different concentrations of acids and therefore produce different concentrations of chlorine dioxide. I recommended my friends in Africa started using 20 drops of stabilized oxygen in a full glass of water with 1 teaspoon of vinegar. Not only did it still cure malaria, but it now cured malaria 100% of the time. Chapter 4. A New Hypothesis. My working hypothesis differs from the popular idea in that oxygen is not the primary agent in killing the malaria parasite, but in fact the formation of chlorine dioxide may be the cure. This provides the answer to the question as to why it worked sometimes and sometimes not. Some people had more activating acids in their stomachs. By pre-activating the solution with vinegar or citric acid, the process is activated prior to digestion, producing sufficient chlorine dioxide to kill the malaria parasite 100% of the time. It also seemed that concentrations of chlorine dioxide kept rising up to 24 hours after activation, which may indicate that this water purification process remained active long after digestion. It does purify the body for several hours after dosage. This is not surprising as the FDA has approved the use of chlorine dioxide to clean kitchens, liquid beverages, and meat for human consumption. Editor's note: to find out more how chlorine dioxide kills pathogens, I recommend work done by Andries Kalker, a biophysicist who treats COVID-19 patients with chlorine dioxide with a 100% success rate. End of note. To my own satisfaction, I proceeded in testing this hypothesis on thousands of people suffering from malaria, and the success rate was 100%. Many of these reported the abatement of several other ailments after the treatment. Users would experiment and develop different protocols, and its administration is much easier these days. It became the miracle mineral solution for thousands of people with a wide variety of ailments. Chlorine and chlorine dioxide have been used to purify water and kill pathogens in hospitals and for many other antiseptic uses for more than 100 years. Lately, chlorine dioxide has been used more and more frequently, especially to purify water. It is also authorized by the FDA to be used to clean chicken, beef, and other foods. Research has proved chlorine dioxide to be much safer than chlorine, as it is selective for pathogens. When used in water, it does not create compounds from other constituents in the water, which chlorine does. Simple chemistry tells us that without doubt the same situation exists in the body. It has been proven that chlorine in drinking water creates at least 3 different carcinogenic compounds when it enters the body, but no such compounds have been found from chlorine dioxide. The American Society of Analytical Chemists stated in 1999 that chlorine dioxide was the most powerful pathogen killer known to man. Epilogue by the editor. After many months of illness while working in Australia, I feared living more than death. My life was devoid of pain or pleasure, happiness or joy. Though I could still cast a shadow, I was neither alive nor dead. Doctors and specialists received all my earnings to stare at blood tests, but none of their incantations would reveal the ailment they suspected was fictitious. It's only I who knew that I spent every weekend in bed. Every day after work I would simply fall over till the alarm clock rang. At a Christmas gathering in 2012, an elderly lady from church, sitting obliquely across the table, kept staring at me until I thought to have a chat with her. She told me without introduction and quite unequivocally, "You are a very sick man." Her declaration was no news to me, but I found her frankness refreshing and her insight remarkable. She could observe in candlelight among much merriment what neither my doctor nor specialist could observe. Mostly, her conclusion validated what only I knew. At least someone would know I did not die from nothing. She told me to come visit her the next day, stating boldly, "I will heal you." Such confidence sounded a bit dogmatic to me, and I thought I saw a red light flashing. Like everybody else, from poet to politician, I view myself more a scientist than a spiritist. But the flashing light was soon extinguished by the deadness that has been dragging me down for more than a year. Visiting her the next day, I showed her the blood test results that the doctors ignored, and she required no incantations to point out a host of ailments and imbalances, of which the most prominent was hemochromatosis, thyroid dysfunction, and an accumulation of heavy metals in my blood. She gave me a book to read, which is the unabridged version of what you just listened to. It's all about the journey to discover a treatment with the unfortunate but understandable name of Miracle Mineral Supplement, or MMS for short. She also gave me twin bottles with citric acid and sodium chloride. When mixed, it has a very powerful smell, and I expected to be either dead or healthy after taking it. Within a few days, I realized a rose by any name or odor can be called a miracle for giving me back my life. I was not healthy yet, but already my fear of dying had been restored. 6 weeks later, a blood test confirmed that the heavy metal count in my blood dropped from 760 to 253, not far from the normal of 220. But in fact, I needed no blood tests to know that I was on my way back to health. Since sharing my experience, I can write my own book on the amount of people who had positive results from using MMS. In the decade since I started using MMS, I have never used antibiotics from a doctor. In fact, I have never been to a doctor with any kind of respiratory illness since, as MMS makes this unnecessary. From using MMS, I have been cured from, or mostly, I have been able to prevent getting the flu. I have also administered MMS to others suffering from flu, abscessed tooth, Crohn's disease, food poisoning, bad breath, and COVID-19, to name a few. I've heard of people abusing and overdosing MMS, and the worst side effect is diarrhea or nausea. In the unabridged version of this book, Jim Humble tells many stories of thousands of people in Africa being healed from malaria, hepatitis, typhoid fever, and AIDS. There is not much to lose in drinking water purification tablets, especially since the process of purification remains active after consumption of the drink. This concludes the reading.